All right. Good afternoon, everybody, to the Rising Tide Foundation's weekly lecture, Sunday afternoon, August 17th. And I'm very pleased hosting today's session. Our fearless leader, Matt, is away at the Badlands Media Conference, and apparently he is giving presentations there, so all the more power to him. And we are here and listening, okay, to my lovely husband. I'm very proud, happy to announce that my dear husband is giving today's lecture on Shakespeare and Marlowe. And actually, okay, in the introduction that Matt had sent out, he said that the Rosicrusians lay claim that one of their scribes, Francis Bacon, was the actual author of Shakespeare's plays. So the question is, who will save Shakespeare from the magicians of the Rosicrucians for the Rosy Cross? Okay, I think this is a kind of a beginning of a series of lectures on the Rosicrucians and this whole okay, magician kind of things that we will play out in the near future for the next few sessions. I know that Cynthia is doing a massive amount of research on it, and she's in the middle of that. And Matt, of course, has done. And today we have the great pleasure of hearing Gerry, who will try, or is attempting to try, to unravel the myth and see that the Republican humanist Christopher Marlowe, okay, could be the real authors of Shakespeare's play. So I'm very eager to hear the proof of that. And with that, I will give it over to my darling husband, Gerry.
Oh, thank you, Magdalena. That was nice. Now, before I start, I just want to give a quick introduction about where this came from, this presentation. And 5 years ago, back in 2020, the Rising Tide Foundation did a symposium. There was about 5 or 6 different presentations around a common theme called Towards an Age of Creative Reason. I was fortunate to give one of them, but it was really, this whole symposium was so revolutionary. And I say that because there were certain ideas in it, ideas that I had never thought of before. And they just stuck in the back of my head and I couldn't shake them. One of them was a presentation by our good friend Martin Seif. He did it on Marlowe as Shakespeare, the drama of political intelligence and the education of citizenry. And that got my interest into the whole idea that Marlowe wrote Shakespeare's play. I'll mention it a little bit in the course of this. The other presentation at the symposium was by our other good friend, Dr. Quan Le, on the I Ching, the poetic principle in the world of the I Ching. And I'd never heard that before, and it was fascinating. So I had these two ideas in the back of my head, and I'd been thinking about it, and I'd be doing research, and I'd sit in the morning and drink my coffee and listen to the birds, and I'd have it in the back of my mind. And so now, after 5 years of working on this and talking over with my feathered friends, I'm going to present what I've discovered so far. So I hope you enjoy it. Get your popcorn and your non-alcoholic beverage ready. And let's see what we can do here. Okay. Now, can everybody see those slides? Yes? Okay, good. So we titled this Christopher Marlowe versus Francis Bacon, the battle for Shakespeare's plays. So this is a story about the plays of William Shakespeare. While some people have claimed that Francis Bacon was the actual author of Shakespeare's plays, there's not much evidence for this claim. However, another theory that I will present to you is that Christopher Marlowe was the actual playwright. While much that has been written about these different theories is very interesting, most of it is merely hearsay or gossip or simply imagined. So today, let's try to unravel what is myth and what is possible, and perhaps we can glimpse a story of what might have really happened. So for people in Canada and the United States, the story that Francis Bacon was the author of Shakespeare's plays was first made famous by a very strange man named Ignatius Loyola Donnelly. That's really his name, Ignatius Loyola Donnelly. He started out as a Democratic lawyer in Philadelphia. Then he moved out west to Minnesota. He got elected to Congress as a Lincoln Republican. He later helped start the Populist Party, and then he became a writer of fiction stories. So one of the first ones he wrote, 1882, he published the book Atlantis, and using all the science and pseudoscience magazines around at the time, he claimed that Atlantis was the original home of the Aryan race when they lived in a golden age before the Great Flood. Now, the next year, he published a second book, Ragnarok. And again, using all the science and pseudoscience magazines, he claimed that this great flood and also the Ice Age was caused by a comet crashing into the earth. I'm sure you've heard that one before. Now, Donnelly, he would have done fine in our day and age. He'd probably have a show on the History Channel with all those aliens and UFO experts. So that's where this stuff starts. Now, a little earlier, say 10 years before Donnelly published that book on Atlantis, another strange man, Edward Bulwer Lytton, that Matt has written a lot about in his discussion of the revenge of the mystery writers. He wrote a book, Vril, The Coming Race, and this was about a race before the flood. And in 1888, this strange lady, Helena Blavatsky, who was born in the same year as Donnelly, you'll see, she would follow up on Bulwer Lytton's book on Atlantis with her own book, The Secret Doctrine. And in The Secret Doctrine, Atlantis is the home of the fourth root race. So these guys are all connected somehow. I won't go into it, maybe for later. But I just wanted to show you where all this stuff comes from. Now, in 1888, the same year Blavatsky came out with her Secret Doctrine book, Donnelly wrote a 2-volume book called The Great Cryptogram, Francis Bacon's Cipher in the so-called Shakespeare plays. Now, the first volume claims to show how the William Shakespeare from Stratford couldn't possibly have written the plays that are attributed to his name. It's not too bad there. But the second volume claims that Donnelly discovered a secret cipher that proves that Francis Bacon was the real author of these plays. The cipher is really hard to understand. But if you read through Donnelly's book, The Great Cryptogram, for proof, he often likes to quote from a Mrs. Henry Pott. Now, who was Mrs. Henry Pott? Well, it seems that her name was Constance Mary Pott, was a lifelong devotee of Francis Bacon. And she wrote a book in 1883, which is 5 years before Donnelly's book, called The Promise of Francis Bacon, that claimed she had deciphered some of Bacon's notebooks and then claimed that this secret decipherment proved that Bacon had written Shakespeare's plays. Again, this cipher thing is really weird to follow. Doesn't make sense. But that's the basis of this whole story that Bacon wrote Shakespeare's plays. And the next year, she wrote that book in 1883. The next year, 1884, she founded the Francis Bacon Society. So now Donnelly, who quoted a lot from her book in his, in 1888, he goes to London. This is after he had published his book, and he went to London to promote it. So, of course, the first place he spoke at was at a Francis Bacon Society meeting with Mrs. Pott. And then he later debated his assertion that Bacon wrote the plays. He debated it at the Oxford Union. He lost 167 to 27. So Oxford didn't believe anything of him. And he debated again at the Cambridge Union, and he lost 120 to 101, but they had 300 abstentions. I guess Cambridge, they couldn't figure out what they wanted to believe. But anyway, so a few years after that, in 1891, Mrs. Pott would write another book called Francis Bacon and His Secret Society. And again, using her secret ciphers, she now claimed that Bacon and his circle were instrumental in the founding of Rosicrucianism, implying that Shakespeare's plays were written by the Rosicrucians. Now, okay, to claim that Bacon was part of a circle of Rosicrucians and alchemists and occultists, that's probably correct. But to then claim that these Rosicrucians wrote Shakespeare's play is so ridiculous, and it's so criminal because it tries to distort our actual cultural history. So now we must also defend Shakespeare's play from the cultural warfare of the Rosicrucians. Besides, the Bacon story is starting to get a little weird with all the secret ciphers and secret societies as their proof. It just makes no sense. However, there is another theory that looks at Shakespeare's authorship. And Martin Seif's presentation to the Rising Tide Foundation 5 years ago on Marlowe as the actual author of Shakespeare's play. People can go back and watch that presentation, but it really, I became fascinated with this, and it kind of really lit a fire under my butt to get me working on it. So, but first, we got to ask, was there really a person in history named William Shakespeare from Stratford upon Avon? Yes, but there are very little details about his actual life. It's as if he was the Invisible Man. It's not even known when he was born. There's only the record of his baptism on April 26th, 1564. So it was around that period. Now, some people made a wild guess saying that he was probably born 3 days before his baptism. Why that? So that it could be said that he was born April 23rd, St. George's Day, and then it could be said that he was born on the same day he died, because he died on April 23rd, 1616. So they made this stuff up. It's not even known if he went to school, any school, not to university, not even to a grammar school. There's no records. So speculations were written to try to account for the necessary education that Shakespeare would have required to be able to write any of Shakespeare's plays, but there's no evidence he went to school. It is not known when Shakespeare was married. There is only the record of November 27th, 1582, that at the age of 18, he obtained a special license to marry, a promise to marry 26-year-old Anne Hathaway. And 6 months later, a daughter, Susanna, was baptized on May 26, 1583. And 2 years after that, they had twins, Judith and Hamnet, who were probably named after their neighbors, Hamnet and Judith Sadler. And the twins were baptized on February 2nd, 1585. And that's pretty well all there is in the official records of the early life of William Shakespeare. And we only learn further details about his life over 90 years after his death from the 1709 edition of Shakespeare's plays by Nicholas Rowe. And in it, he writes sort of a biography of Shakespeare. It's called Some Account of the Life, etc., of Mr. William Shakespeare. And I just want to read a short little part of it. He had, by a misfortune common enough to young fellows, fallen into ill company, and amongst them some that made a frequent practice of deer stealing, engaged him with them more than once in robbing a part that had belonged to Sir Thomas Lucy of Churlicot near Stratford. So William Shakespeare was hanging around with some bad people, deer stealing. Now, for this, he was prosecuted by Sir Thomas, by that gentleman, as he thought somewhat too severely, and in order to revenge that ill usage, he made a ballad upon it. And though this, probably the first essay of his poetry, be lost, yet it is said to have been so very bitter that it redoubled the prosecution against him to that degree that he was obliged to leave his business and family in Warwickshire for some time and shelter himself in London. So he had to take off. But it does say he had a business and he had a family there that he left for some time. Now, it is at this time and upon this account that he is said to have made his first acquaintance in the playhouse. He was received into the company then in being, at first, in a very mean rank. Now, what does that mean, a very mean rank? Well, to find out, a further account is given over 50 years after this was published in a 1765 edition of Shakespeare's play, where a small passage is added at the end of Rowe's account of the life of Shakespeare, and it was written by Samuel Johnson. And this is what Samuel Johnson adds. When Shakespeare fled to London from the terror of a criminal prosecution, his first expedient was to wait at the door of the playhouse and hold the horses of those that had no servants, that they might be ready again after the performance. In this office, he became so conspicuous for his care and readiness that in a short time every man as he alighted called for Will Shakespeare, and scarcely any other waiter was trusted with a horse while Will Shakespeare could be had. This was the first dawn of better fortune. Shakespeare, finding more horses put into his hand than he could hold, hired boys to wait under his inspection, who, when Will Shakespeare was summoned, were immediately to present themselves, quote, "I am Shakespeare's boy, sir." In time, Shakespeare found higher employment, but as long as the practice of riding to the playhouse continued, the waiters that held the horses retained the appellation of Shakespeare's boys. So this is what William Shakespeare from Stratford, was doing at the playhouse. And apparently he was quite good at it. And this is what little we know of the early life of the actual William Shakespeare from Stratford, and of how he came into association with the playhouses. Everything else that's written about the early life of William Shakespeare is someone's speculation or imagination. And what little we do know that I read to you was written almost 100 years after he died. But did William Shakespeare of Stratford, the son of a glove maker and wool trader, with no known education and no known history, except for when he was about to be arrested for poaching on the estate of a lord, fled to London and found employment by waiting with the horses of patrons going to this theater, did he suddenly become a published poet and one of the leading playwrights in all of London? Wow. But why was he the only one able to pull off such a miracle? Huh? Anyway, let's see what happens next. So, the first time that we will see the name Shakespeare in print is in 1593. The poem Venus and Adonis was registered in April 1593 and was published in June 1593. And while the title page did not show an author's name, the dedication page, which was probably added later, was signed by, quote, William Shakespeare. Now, the next year, 1594, a person named, in May 1594, the poem Lucrece was registered and was published, again, with no author's name on the front page, on the title page, but with the dedication page again, perhaps added later, signed by a William Shakespeare. And by the end of 1594, a person named William Shakespeare became a shareholder in a play company, negotiated with his offer of a play script and a promise of more, based on what? On his two poems? However, an important point has to be remembered about this period, that the London theaters were closed from the summer of 1593 until the summer of 1594 because of an outbreak of the plague. So that our William Shakespeare from Stratford, that waited with the horses of patrons attending the theater, would have become very unemployed since the theaters were shut down. Now, are we to believe that he just hung around and then on a whim, looking for a new job, he decided to start writing poetry instead? And very good poetry for his first attempt, too, I must say. Or may we more reasonably assume that being presently unemployed and not wishing to be in London during the plague, he took this opportunity to return home, straighten things out with the Lord for poaching his deers, rejoining his wife and 3 children, and with his newfound confidence in his business ability, set up shop at Stratford-upon-Avon. Now, what if we suppose that these 2 poems, Venus and Adonis and Lucrece, may have been written by someone else, and that while no author's name was listed when the poems were being prepared for publication, a dedication page was simply added later. So perhaps an unassuming name was later chosen as the author's name, like the name of the simple peasant who watched patrons' horses while they watched a play. Shakespeare was a fairly common name in Warwickshire, And so the author's name was given as William Shakespeare. Perhaps. But now let's look at the life of Christopher Marlowe and whether he could have been the actual author of these two poems and of the later plays of Shakespeare. Now, Christopher Marlowe was baptized 2 months before William Shakespeare of Stratford on February 26, 1564, in Canterbury, which is a town made famous by Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. I hope everyone's read them. If not, that's on your to-do list. Marlowe later studied at Cambridge from 1580 until he graduated in 1587. So he was quite well educated. But it turns out Cambridge University was withholding Marlowe's Master of Arts degree in 1587 on suspicion that he had attended the Jesuit seminary at Reims in France. During his lengthy absences from the university during the 1584 to 85 session and the 1585 to 1586 academic years. So he was gone for quite a while in those 2 years, and the university claimed he had gone to the Jesuit seminary at Reims in France. Now, there is a very revealing letter from June of 1587 that helped Marlowe get his degree. It was sent to Cambridge University and signed by Queen Elizabeth's counselors, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, Whitgift, and the Chancellor of the University, Lord Burleigh, Lord Cecil. And I'll just read it. It's interesting. Whereas it was reported that Christopher Morley, that's Christopher Marlowe, was determined to have gone beyond the seas to Reims and there to remain, their lordships thought good to certify that he had no such intent, but that in all his actions he had behaved himself orderly and discreetly, to be rewarded for his faithful dealings. Their lordships' request was that the rumor thereof should be allayed by all possible means, and that he should be furthered in the degree he was to take this next commencement, because it was not Her Majesty's pleasure that anyone employed as he had been in matters touching the benefit of his country should be defamed by those that are ignorant in the affairs he went about. So they're telling you he was working for he was working for some kind of intelligence operation for the Queen, for the benefit of his country, it says right there, and for Her Majesty's pleasure. So it can be assumed from that reference to benefit of his country that Marlowe was employed with gathering intelligence for the English Secret Service of the Secretary of State, Francis Walsingham. Just as a note, Francis Walsingham's cousin, Thomas Walsingham, who would take over some of his networks when his cousin Francis died, Thomas Walsingham would later become Marlowe's patron. So that's the circle where Marlowe is working in. Also, Cambridge University was a major recruiting ground for such intelligence agents to gather and deliver information to Queen Elizabeth's ministers, because they were well educated there. Reims was the location in France for an English seminary for those exiled English Catholics to study, and for some of them, not all of them, but for some of them to be secretly sent back to England as missionaries. It was a hotbed of rumored and actual plots against Elizabeth. and it was financially supported by Philip Habsburg, the King of Spain, and also Pope Gregory the 13th. Now, at that time, the Habsburgs pretty well controlled Europe. They controlled the Holy Roman Empire in Spain, all of Europe except for France and England. And this is where the politics is, and this is what Marlowe was part of. Now, there were two kinds of Catholics at Rheims and in France at that time. One of them, we can see a man by the name of Jean Bodin, who wrote the 6 books of the Republic in 1576, and the Demonomania of the Sorcerers, sort of a witch hunter's guide, if you want, in 1580. And Bodin became the president of the Third Estate in the French Parliament. And the year after he wrote the book on witch hunting, 1580, in 1581, he made a trip to England. And Bodin, his policy, he wanted the King of France, at that time Henry III, to unite his subjects by all holy and legitimate means without war. And he organized for a national council to resolve the matters of religion. He wanted freedom of religion in France, whether you were Catholic or Protestants, it didn't matter. You were French. Now, there were other kinds of Catholics in France under the Duke of Guise. There's his picture there. Now, the Duke of Guise sought violent means to settle the religious question, as they did in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in Paris in 1572. Now, Marlowe may have posed as a convert escaping from England and wishing to study with the Jesuits at Rheims. But he was sent to gather any information concerning suspicious activities against Queen Elizabeth. Now, Marlowe was very intelligent. He had a Bachelor of Arts degrees. He was fluent in French, and he was presumably destined to enter the church after his studies. He had all the right credentials, and as the letter attests, he was employed for the benefit of his country and earned Her Majesty's pleasure. Now, at that time, when Marlowe was in France, a secret plot was begun at Rheims to assassinate Elizabeth. This was to foment a rebellion in the ensuing chaos that would coincide with a Spanish invasion of England to place Mary Stuart on the English throne. Now, Mary Stuart was the daughter of James V of Scotland and Mary of Guise, the son of the Duke, the daughter of the Duke. Now, Walsingham's spies were able to uncover this plot and to decipher the letters of the conspirators and Mary. 14 of the conspirators were arrested, tried for treason, and executed. Mary was put on trial, found guilty, and executed in February 1587, rather. The next year, 1588, the Spanish Armada's invasion of England occurred, but it was defeated by the English Navy, which was under the command of Admiral Charles Howard. Now, Admiral Charles Howard was also the patron of a playing company, a company of actors, which was known as the Admiral's Men, which we'll see later. So, after Marlowe's service for his country and after graduating from Cambridge, he then went to London, where he became part of a circle of poets and playwrights, and he received payment for his play Tamburlaine from the Lord Admiral's Men. right? Which was the patron was Admiral Charles Howard. Now, Marlowe also wrote other plays. One was called The Jew of Malta, and in 1590, and Dr. Faustus in 1592, and Massacre at Paris in 1593, but there's really no copies of that. It didn't survive. Now, while Marlowe was living in London, with the circle of poets and playwrights, he may have been introduced to a group of artisans called the Areopagus. And the Areopagus was formed by two good friends, Gabriel Harvey, who was a don at Cambridge when Marlowe was studying there, and Edmund Spenser, who had studied at Cambridge with his friend Harvey. And they met at the house of Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. Now, the Areopagus, they experimented with different meters. They were trying to get the right meter for the English language. So they were experimenting with different meters for English verse. And also they had to invent new words because sometimes there just wasn't a word to describe it. So they would take, Italian or Greek words and sort of anglicize them. And they became very good at that. Now, in 1579, Edmund Spenser anonymously published a pamphlet, The Shepherd's Calendar. And this really was literary propaganda, political propaganda that presented the view of the circles around the Earl of Leicester, where they were meeting. And it promoted the proposed marriage of Queen Elizabeth, with Francis Hercule, the younger brother of King Henry III. So they were trying to get this alliance with England and France through marriage. That's how they did it in those days. Now, this alliance promised to end the religious war by the toleration of Protestants in France. It promised to end Catholic conspiracies against Elizabeth in England, and it proposed the support of both England and France, plus France's ally, the Ottomans, which is not talked about much, but interesting. Ottomans are portrayed to be so bad, but not so. They were the ally of France. Anyway, England, France, and the Ottomans were going to support the Dutch revolt in the Spanish Netherlands. Now, the next year, with the help of Leicester, Spenser was sent to Ireland as secretary to Lord Grey, who was the new Lord Deputy of Ireland. And while he was living there, Spenser would begin working on his projected 12 books of the Fairy Queen. He never finished 12. But the intention behind the Fairy Queen was each book was about a different virtue that would be needed, and the different virtues of an English hero, so that England could rediscover those virtues. And in the Fairy Queen, we will see how these virtues transformed a Prince Arthur into a King Arthur. The book is about Prince Arthur, not King Arthur, but it's sort of the epistemological journey of Prince Arthur to become something. Now, the first three books of the Fairy Queen were published in 1590. And after 10 years living in Ireland, Spenser returned to England for a year, and he was meeting with some of his old school friends, some of his friends from the Areopagus, and some new friends, probably. Now, there was a circle of poets and playwrights that met at the home of Sir Walter Raleigh. And these were people like Thomas Kit and Christopher Marlowe. Now, Spenser, when he was younger, had been a classmate with Kidd. And at that time, in 1590, Kidd and Marlowe were sharing lodgings. So, you can easily see how Spenser and Marlowe would have met there. Now, in October 1591, the Queen issued a proclamation against the Catholic plots against her, especially the Jesuits. And in March 1592, a Jesuit by the name of Robert Person, who was a member of the Guise faction, the Duke of Guise, he wrote a pamphlet in reply to the Queen's proclamation. And it included, I'm just going to read a few lines out of this pamphlet to give you an idea. He said, Sir Walter Raleigh's school of atheism, by the way, and of the conjurer that is master thereof, and of the diligence used to get young gentlemen this school, wherein both Moses and our Savior, the Old Testament and New Testament, are justed at, and the scholars taught, among other things, to spell God backwards, right? Instead of G-O-D, it's D-O-G instead of G-O-D. Now, this Jesuit slander began the whisperings and rumors against Raleigh and his school as being atheists. Now, the thing to understand at that time in England, a charge of atheism not only meant denying the existence of God, but it meant denying the sovereigns, Queen Elizabeth's God-given right to rule over the realm and the church. So if you were called an atheist back then, that was a crime of treason. So at the end of July 1592, after this pamphlet came out, Walter Raleigh was imprisoned, but no official reason is ever given for it. They have this wild story that it was because Raleigh married one of the Queen's chambermaids without her permission. But he was eventually released. Again, they don't say why. Now, it was shortly after this pamphlet came out and this attack on Raleigh that there occurred the attack on Marlowe. So the next year, 1593, early 1593, there were riots in England against the immigrant communities in London. In March, when Parliament debated a bill to extend the privileges for immigrant traders, meaning the Dutch merchants, one of those who argued against it was Raleigh, opposing granting them concessions and privileges, but to expel them and to end their stranglehold on the economy. So Raleigh was against the Dutch because of their takeover of the English economy. I don't go into more of that, but that's just the setting for this. Now, soon after this, anti-immigrant posters began to appear, but not arguing like Raleigh, but were violently trying to echo his anti-immigrant views. One such anti-Dutch poster was put up at a church on May 5th, and the poster was signed Tamburlaine. Now, everyone would have known Tamburlaine. That's the title of Marlowe's play. Now, here's how the poster started. You strangers that inhabit in this land, note this same writing, do it understand, conceive it well for safeguard of your lives, your goods, your children, and your dearest wives. Your Machiavellian merchant spoils the state. Your usury doth leave us all for dead. Your artifacts and craftsmen works our fate, and like the Jews, you eat us up as bread. And near the end, he says, since words nor threats nor any other thing can make you to avoid this certain ill, we'll cut your throats in your temples praying. Not Paris massacre, so much blood did spill. Now, whoever wrote this poster certainly knew of Marlowe's play Tamburlaine, because it's signed Tamburlaine. And he knew of his play The Jew of Malta, because he references the Jews in this poster too. And in The Jew of Malta, that play, you have the ghost of Machiavelli speak in the prologue. So again, this reference to your Machiavellian merchant. He knew the Jew of Malta play. And the last line, Paris Massacre, that implies that the author of all the plays was the same person, Marlowe, because those are the plays he wrote. So this libel was meant directly to implicate Marlowe as well as Raleigh. So a reward was offered for any information about the posters, and the Privy Council set up a special commission to arrest the authors of these libels because it was fomenting violence. Now, one playwright who was a victim of informer, whoever the informer was subsequently arrested, Thomas Kidd. Thomas Kidd, we met earlier. He was a friend of Spencer's, went to school with him, and he was also lodging with Marlowe. So Thomas Kidd was the author of the Spanish tragedy. Now, when his lodgings were searched, no evidence relating to the poster was found, but it was claimed that 3 pages of atheistic writings were found instead. Now, Kidd was tortured, and under torture, it was claimed that he confessed that these writings belonged to his roommate, Christopher Marlowe. Now, Thomas Kidd was never the same after being tortured. He died the next year. So after this, a warrant was issued for the rest of Marlowe, who then came and appeared before the court, and he was released, granted bail, and told to wait until he was summoned. Meanwhile, an informer was sent to gather any hearsay or gossip that could be used against Marlowe at his trial, where the punishment for such a crime was to be burned at the stake for atheism. Now, were the arrests of Kidd and Marlowe done because of some anti-Dutch poster placed at a church? Or were the arrests of Kidd and Marlowe done because of the play about Dr. Faustus and the scandal about magic and necromancy? Or the play about St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, the Paris Massacre, and the threat of riots to start a religious war? Was this all part of an actual witch hunt launched against Raleigh and his circle that included Marlowe, and who were targeted by the Jesuit Robert Persons, perhaps by those same circles that Marlowe had spied on at Rheims that were implicated in the Babington plot and were hung? Now, before Marlowe could be put on trial and possibly suffer the same fate as Thomas Kidd, he would mysteriously die on May 30th, which was the last day of his bail. So he had to go to court the next day. Luckily, he couldn't go because he died. Now, the actual coroner's report of this killing, which was found later, you can read it online, was written by a man named William Darby, who was the Queen's coroner, the coroner of the household to the Queen. And not some little local official. This was the royal coroner, right, who wrote the coroner's report. Now, let's read a little bit about it. So it says, Ingram, Fraser, Christopher Morley, Nicholas Skeers, and Robert Poley met together in a room and there passed the time together and dined. And after supper, the said Ingram and Christopher Morley were in speech and uttered one to the other diverse malicious words, for the reason that they could not be at one nor agree about payment of the sum of pence, that is, the reckoning. So The reckoning of the bill was supposed to be the cause of the fight that resulted in the death of Marlowe? Well, hang on a second. Let's look at these four people who were meeting at the inn that day when Marlowe was so-called killed. Okay, let's look at Nicholas Skeers. Well, he worked for the Earl of Essex. Robert Poley, he worked as a spy for Francis Walsingham, and he was also part of the uncovering of the Babington plot. Now, Ingram Freezer, he worked for Francis Walsingham's cousin, Thomas Walsingham. And Thomas Walsingham was also the patron of Christopher Marlowe. So, why would one of these four friends who all worked in the same political circle want to kill Marlowe? Or was Marlowe being set up as the patsy, but not to be killed, but to make it look that way? Perhaps a different conspiracy had been quickly hatched to claim that Marlowe had indeed been killed with the staging of his death that also would have stopped any further attacks on Marlowe and his compatriots. Now, I just want to some of the books that have been written that I used on the so-called death of Christopher Marlowe. One, The Death of Christopher Marlowe by J. Leslie Hodson. He wrote that in 1925. I like that one because he's actually a Canadian. So there you go, you Canadians. We did something good. Now, another one, The Reckoning, The Murder of Christopher Marlowe by Charles Nicholl in 1995. Now, this reckoning happened on May 30th, 1593. And it was at this point that we saw the entry onto the world stage of the name of William Shakespeare. Venus and Adonis was registered in April before the reckoning without an author's name, but was published in June after the reckoning with William Shakespeare's name in the dedication. Lucrece was registered the next year in May 1594 with no author's name and later published with William Shakespeare's name in the dedication. Also, in the autumn of 1593, a poem, Hero and Leander, was registered, but it wasn't published until 5 years later in 1598, when the author was given as Christopher Marlowe. So right around the time of Marlowe's so-called death is when we then begin to see the name of William Shakespeare appear. So let's just restate our hypothesis before proceeding. That Marlowe's death was fake and staged, that after William Shakespeare had left London to return to Stratford-upon-Avon in 1593, the name of William Shakespeare was used by Christopher Marlowe to be the purported author of his plays. Now, why should our hypothesis be any less valid than any other person's speculation about secret ciphers and secret societies? To be honest, the story of William Shakespeare's life is just that, an imagined story. And secondly, Shakespeare's plays have to be looked at with the political situation at that time. For whoever wrote those plays was quite intimate with the political players and the stakes at play. Now, if we're correct in our theory about Marlowe, then until things had quieted down a little, Marlowe would have to leave England. But where? Where would he go? Well, as we will see, for France, and I think especially for Italy. Now, one of the first plays after Marlowe's faked death was As You Like It, which is set in France. And in the play, Jacques says, and I'm sure everyone's heard this, All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. So what's he getting at? And then Touchstone says a little later, when a man's verses cannot be understood, nor a man's good wit seconded with the forward child understanding, it strikes a man more dead than a great reckoning in a little room. Maybe Marlowe's referring to the reckoning, right? The paying of the bill at the inn, where his death was staged, right? A reckoning in a little room. Now, this is very interesting. The next quote, where Phoebe says, dead shepherd, now I find thy saw of might. Who ever loved that loved not at first sight? I'm sure everyone has heard that about whoever loved that didn't love at first sight. Where did this line come from? Now, when he says the dead shepherd, in those days, a shepherd was another word for a poet. So the dead shepherd, the dead poet, and his saw is a saying. So the dead shepherd and his saw, it then repeats word for word, whoever loved that loved not at first sight, which is a line that is taken directly from Marlowe's Hero and Leander, which was registered in 1593, but it was not published or it was not read by anyone else until 1598. So only Marlowe could have written this play because he used a line out of his own poem that only he would have known of, word for word. Now, Marlowe continued writing comedy plays. All's Well That Ends Well, which is set in both France and Italy. It has its plot taken from a story in Decameron by Boccaccio, wherein Helena fakes her death in order to entrap her husband. Interesting. Romeo and Juliet, set in Verona, and taken from a writer named Bandello, has Juliet pretending to be dead in order to avoid a marriage. Much Ado About Nothing, set in Messina, and again taken from Bandello, has Hero pretending death to cause remorse in others. Twelfth Night, set in Illyria and taken from Bandello, has Sebastian and Viola presuming each other dead. Measure for Measure, set in Vienna and taken from Cinthio, another writer, has Claudio assumed dead to avoid execution. So I think you see the theme here that this idea of fake death is used quite often in Marlowe's plays. Now, the next one, this is the masterpiece. A Midsummer Night's Dream, set in Athens, and again taken from Boccaccio, has the workmen perform a play where Pyramus mistakenly thinks that Thisbe is dead. And also, this play, very important, uses the idea of a play within a play, which is to show us that things may not always be as they appear. And this play reminded me of the presentation that Kwan did at the same symposium with Martin. And he did it on the I Ching. And the idea of the lower trigram, right, where we're motivated by our emotions, right, the realm of time, and also the upper trigram, where we're motivated by ideas of beauty, goodness, and truth. And it's to continue on our, as Kwan says, our epistemological journey, we have to move from the bottom trigram into the top trigram. And if we look at this play, Midsummer Night's Dream, you have the one setting is in Athens, where the king and queen of Athens are going to get married. And that's in Act 1 and Act 5. In between, in Act 2 and Act 3 and Act 4, is the forest outside of the city, which is the land of the fairies, ruled by the king and queen of the fairies. And how do we get from the real world to the land of fairies and back? How do we get from the real world to the world of ideas and back to apply it in our everyday life? And in the play, there's these workmen. There's a picture of them. It's actually funny in the play, who are enactors who are going to perform a play at the king and queen of Athens' wedding. And they go to the forest, the land of the fairies, to practice and then come back and perform it. So it's like Marlowe is saying that it is the play that can go between the land of time and the land of timelessness, right? Between reality here and the reality of ideas. And it's, he says it's the poet has to take a glimpse of these timeless ideas while we're in the land of the fairies, say, and be able to show it to our audience who are living back here on Earth in the land of space and time. And there's this quote in Act 5 in the play I just want to read, but also it's just so interesting that if you go to Rising Tide Foundation and look for that symposium for 5 years ago, and Matt and Cynthia write a nice little introduction about what the symposium is, at the very end of that introduction is this same quote from the King of Athens. So I just want to read it. See, it gives you a sense of what Marlowe's trying to tell us. It's simple. It's not elaborate. It's very simple. But the poet's eye, in a fine frenzy rolling, doth glance from heaven to earth, and from earth to heaven. And as imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. So it's Marlowe, in a simple way, is just beginning to get an idea of the ideas of the I Ching, I guess. Maybe he found a copy of it. But it's also, he's telling us what his mission is, right? What a poet's mission is, to give them a glimpse of heaven that you can then, bring down to a local habitation and give it a name. And that's to enable the audience to develop in their epistemological journey. And after this, Marlowe's plays change. I mean, before that, they were okay, but now they're getting good. They're really getting good. And I'm sure other poets had the same idea as Marlowe, but he writes it down in black and white right there in Act 5. It's brilliant. So, okay, let's move on. I don't want to spend too much. I could spend all day on A Midsummer's Night's Dream. Someone should do a presentation on it. Or, what's better yet? We're going to bring back the, test for people who want to be in the civil service. You have to pass this test. And one of the tests will be you have to memorize that passage from Midsummer's Night Dream, and you have to explain it. So that'll be the meritocracy exam in Canada. Midsummer's Night Dream will be part of it. Okay, so the next play, which is set in France, this is wild. Love's Labour's Lost. And it's Marlowe's report on the situation in France. You have, in the play, King Ferdinand of Navarre and his three companions swear off the company of women for 3 years. They're going to have nothing to do with women. All right. But their infatuation with the Princess of France makes them break their promise. They can't keep it for 3 years. Now, of the characters in the play, you have Ferdinand of Navarre. Could Marlowe be referring to the future King Henry of Navarre? The three companions of the king. Lord Brown, could he be the Duc de Baron? Lord Longueville, could he be the Duc de Longueville? I think so. And Lord Dumaine, could he be the Duc de Mayenne? Pardon my accent. I'm not too good at French, but it's funny how you see the similarities in these names. Now, where they swore off women for 3 years, could all this be referring to the 3 years of war, the wars of succession after the death of Henry III, until Henry Navarre denounced Protestantism and converted to Catholicism for his love of France, right? And to become the king. And in the play, there's a Spanish visitor, and that may refer to all the Spanish intrigues behind the secession. Another play, The Merchant of Venice, was set in Venice and taken from a novella by Giovanni Fiorentino. Marlowe really likes these Italian playwrights. Now, in The Merchant of Venice, Portia disguises herself as a young male lawyer in order to be able to save her husband's friend. And although she wins the court case on a technicality, in her speech, she talks of a much higher sense of justice, right? She says, the quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as a gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. So it's giving us a glimpse of a higher ideal than that which Marlowe laid out in his Midsummer Night's Dream. Now, also, Marlowe may have had in mind the Edict of Nantes. In September 1597, Henry IV, the new king of France, with troops sent from Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth of England, finally ended France's war with Philip II of Spain, forcing the surrender of the Spanish army in France at Amiens. Then, in April the next year, Henry IV signed the Edict of Nantes that restored civil rights to the Huguenots. That's the Protestants. So he restored their civil rights and granted them protection from the Inquisition, which was amazing. Now, in 1598, the Peace of Vervins was signed between France, Spain, and delegates from the Pope that recognized Henry as the King of France, and it withdrew all Spanish forces from France, and it withdrew all Spanish support for the Duke of Guise's Catholic League that supported him. So, a very important two plays that had very much connection with the political situation at that time. Also, what's interesting, just as a note, around that time in 1598, a William Shakespeare was listed as one of the actors in the cast that performed Ben Jonson's play Every Man in His Humor. Now, was this actor the uneducated and untrained William Shakespeare from Stratford-upon-Avon? Or was it the Cambridge-educated and dramatist Christopher Marlowe using his pen name, William Shakespeare? I would like to assume that Marlowe was this actor and that he had now returned to England from his 5-year exile in France. And so I was thinking, why would Marlowe return? Well, maybe he felt it was safe to return. And maybe after the Peace of Vervins was signed in France, his work in France was done. Or perhaps he had a new assignment. Because as we saw the two opposing forces in France, the two different types of Catholics, Jean Bodin versus the Duke of Guise, two opposing policies can be seen in Elizabethan England. One was to begin the colonization of America, actual colonization, not, the looting and that. Or two, to take part in the rape and pillage of the Americans by stealing some of the loot from the Spanish Empire. So there was two policies, being whispered in the ear of Elizabeth, you could say. And this continuing fight between colonization or empire building is seen in both the establishment of the British East India Company in 1600, and I think people have a good idea of what the British East India Company, their genocide, they accomplished throughout the world, but also the founding of the Virginia Company and the Plymouth Company in 1606, which initially was a very good colonization project that was started. Now, 1598, the year we think Marlowe returned to England. Very important year. In 1598, a friend of Marlowe's named George Chapman would register and publish the first installment of his translation of Homer's Iliad. Finally, we're going to get to read Homer in English in England, huh? So anyway, he was in a rush and he just published the chapters that were about Achilles. And he would dedicate them to the most honored now living instance of the Achillean virtues, eternized by divine Homer, the Earl of Essex. So he was, perhaps with the lessons of the Trojan War, he was trying to influence Robert Devereux, who was the Earl of Essex, and who was also the stepson of Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, and educate him in Achillean virtue, right? It was a project. Now, Marlowe also seems to have been a part of this study of Achilles with his friend Chapman to try to influence the Earl of Essex in the question of leadership. And Marlowe's play, Troilus and Cressida, is set in Troy near the end of the Trojan War and shows us the tragedy of Helen and Paris, of Troilus and Cressida, and of Achilles and Ajax and Hector, right? Was all this war worth all the fighting and hazards and losses? Now, the education of Essex, this project with Chapman and Marlowe, may also have been on his mind when Marlowe wrote the famous play Henry V, which is one of my favorites, because Marlowe conveys his idea of a hero, not this boulderized crap we see of superheroes today with the Hollywood version, but what really is a hero. What he says, Harry the King, right? With all his warts and scars, who wasn't a typical genius or a great warrior, but he was an individual who nonetheless realized that for whatever reason, by whatever accident of fate, it had become his responsibility to lead, right? And he saw that responsibility as a search for honor, something higher, something in the higher trigram, the higher realm of ideas. And here's just a short quote from one of his speeches, if people can see that. This is a famous speech before the Battle of Agincourt. And in those days, you only fought during good weather. And then when winter come on, both armies would stop fighting, and they would go to a town where they would stay there for the winter and recuperate and get ready to go at it again next spring. So the English thought, yeah, the fighting's over. We're marching on our way to, a town we're going to spend the winter. They're tired. It's raining out. They're exhausted from fighting all year. But the King of France decides, no, we're going to have one more battle. So he rounds up a whole new army and sends it to fight the English, who think they're going into winter retirement, right? So he's got the French outnumber the English 4 or 5 to 1. They're all rested. They're well rested. They're all fresh horses. It's going to be a massacre, so it looks. And so one guy says, it's Henry V's cousin. He says, "Oh man, today it's a holiday back in England, and all these jerks are running around doing nothing. They're just partying and drinking and eating." And he says, "Oh, if we only had 1/10,000th of those people here to fight with us, we could win." See, now at this point, Henry realizes the problem right there. Despair. The minute you have despair in your troops, you've lost before you even fire the first shot. So he's got to deal with this right now. And he gives this speech, a famous speech. People know it, the "We Happy Few" speech. But I just want to read a little bit of it to give you his idea. He says, "By Jove, I am not covetous for gold, nor care I who doth feed upon my cost. It yearns me not if men my garments wear. So such outward things dwell not in my desire. But if it be a sin to covet honor, I am the most offending soul alive." So he says, "No, my cousin, wish not a man from England," right? Because he tries to give them a sense of immortality, that there's something to their lives, right? Later on in the speech, he says, "This story shall the good man teach his son. And Crispin shall ne'er go by from this day until the ending of the world. But we in it shall be remembered." So he's giving him this idea of immortality, to be remembered. And it's the same thing that Quan is talking about in the I Ching. And that's where he goes on, "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today who sheds his blood with me shall be my brother. Be he ne'er so vile, this day shall gentle his condition." Excuse me. "And gentlemen in England now abed will think themselves accursed they were not here, and hold their manhoods cheap while any speaks who fought with us upon St. Crispin's Day." It's wow, what a speech. I had to memorize that speech once. I did at an event once. But it really gets you into the mind of Marlowe, what his idea of this hero is. It's what Quan says is kairos. It's the moment in which a person has to make a very important decision, and he has to make the right one. And that's what makes a hero, not this superhero nonsense, being perfect all the time. No. It's the heroic moment, the moment when you have to decide to do something. So Marlowe really understands that whole issue. Now, in 1599, getting back to our story here, excuse me, all this smoke in the air, Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, was made the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, and he was sent to put down the Irish rebellion that was also being aided by Spain and Scotland and the Pope. Now, there were rumors of an attack coming from the Spanish Armada, and the ships and supplies that Essex needed were not being sent. So instead, he negotiated a ceasefire with the Irish. Sounds good to me, but there was massive opposition to this back in London, and it was led by Robert Cecil, who was the son of Lord Burleigh. We'll see something about Cecil later. And Cecil had Essex placed in solitary confinement, hoping to end his power, to end his influence at court. And Essex was brought before an 18-member special commission to hear the charges that were prepared against him by 4 lawyers. Now, one of these lawyers was a man named Francis Bacon, a very vindictive Francis Bacon, because this political slime mold, Francis Bacon, he had been an advisor to the Earl of Essex, starting back in 1591, him and his brother. But when Essex came back from Ireland and seeing the way the wind was blowing against him, Bacon abandoned Essex and joined Cecil and those others who were plotting against Essex. Now, although Essex would finally been released from custody, he was banned from the court and he was now bankrupt anyway, so he wasn't going to do much. Now, in the meantime, our good friend Robert Cecil, he was secretly corresponding with James of Scotland to assure him of his support in the succession. And so Essex and his supporters were drawn into a final rebellion to seize the court and to topple Cecil and restore Essex as the Queen's favorite. But the hastily ill-organized rebellion failed, and Essex and his supporters were arrested and charged with treason. Now, our good friend Francis Bacon was now charged with gathering the evidence from confessions of the prisoners and from torture, whatever, to use in the prosecution to prove the guilt of Essex, who was found guilty and executed in February 1601. Now, Queen Elizabeth died 2 years later in March of 1603, and with the death of Elizabeth came the end of Elizabethan England. And due to Cecil's secret correspondence with James Stuart in Scotland, Stuart made a smooth transition from King of Scotland to become King of Great Britain, and he soon made peace with Spain. He made Cecil a baron, and Francis Bacon was knighted. He was made Solicitor General, and then Attorney General, and finally Lord Chancellor. But he was soon, Parliament soon found him guilty of corruption, that is bribery. And he was banned from holding office, and he actually ended his life in disgrace and poverty. So much for Francis Bacon. Now, this tragedy of Essex may have been in Marlowe's thoughts when he wrote the play Othello, which was set in Venice with the manipulative Iago. And that should remind us of this Venetian disease, they call it, the Venetian party it was called, that was beginning to infect England, as we see with Francis Bacon and Robert Cecil. Now, it is a proven fact that Bacon was in correspondence with one of the notorious Venetians named Paolo Sarpi. And I have read that Bacon's so-called method that everyone goes goo goo gaga over is just a rehash of Sarpi's, and it was promoted as if it was something original or meaningful. which it really wasn't. And I think other people will go into it, Matt, especially on the fraud of Francis Bacon's writings. Now, let's get back to our Christopher Marlowe here. Only a bit to go. I hope people still have some popcorn left. Now, Marlowe may have had James Stewart in mind when he wrote the play Hamlet, the tragedy of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark. And it might have referred to the fight that occurred over the Scottish succession, which is very similar to the plot in Hamlet. Now, Henry Stewart, James Stewart's father, was murdered in February 1567. And less than 6 months later, his wife, Mary Stuart, daughter of a Guise, married James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell. And many of the Spanish lords suspected that it was Bothwell who was behind the murder of Henry Stuart. So it's a very similar plot to what happens in Hamlet. Now, James's wife was Anne of Denmark. So something is rotten in the state of Denmark, as they say in the play. Now, okay, Macbeth. Marlowe's play Macbeth. This may also refer to James Stewart and to the three witches in the play. Now, when James' wife, Anne, she was still in Denmark, and she wanted to come to Scotland to join him in ruling in Scotland. Now, she was unable to sail from Denmark to join him in Scotland because of the constant bad weather. And witches in Denmark were being burnt for being behind the unusual weather. Now, James thought that this was happening in Scotland too. And so now you had witch trials that were held in Scotland where women were found guilty of conjuring terrible storms, and some of them were put to death. So you have that whole scene, you know, in Macbeth with the three witches, right? Double, double toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble. So it's got something to do with the witches that they were killing. Then also, Marlowe has three plays which are set in Rome: Coriolanus, Julius Caesar, and Antony and Cleopatra. And Marlowe here is studying the ending of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire and what could be the potential future of England. And there's just one interesting thing in Tragedy of Julius Caesar, where the one person who probably could have saved the Roman Republic, Cicero, was giving a speech, and they were asking, what did he say in this Casca the Cynic that I played in a version of the play we performed once? He says, yeah, he spoke, but it was all Greek to me. So the cynic is saying we didn't even listen to Cicero, the one man who could have saved the Republic. It's all Greek to me. So very interesting line he puts there. Now, one of my other favorite plays, King Lear. In Marlowe's play, King Lear, which is about he was a real king, the ancient Britain kings before the Norman conquest. And maybe we can imagine it about the people around Queen Elizabeth, you know, who are just like Lear. They're going mad in the uncertainty of the succession as around Lear. And perhaps we can see the people around Essex, just like Lear's daughter Cordelia, who, though she was in the right, she failed to act to change Lear, right? What was the line? To love and be silent, right? a key failure in her Keros moment. And Cordelia marries the King of France, but she does come back to England to try to save her father and try to restore peace. And when Lear is finally found by Cordelia and he sees his utter foolishness, but also he sees his daughter's forgiveness, he has this line, which I just like so much. He says, "Come, let's away to prison. We two alone will sing like birds in the cage. When thou dost ask me blessing, I'll kneel down and ask of thee forgiveness. So we'll live and pray and sing and tell old tales and laugh at gilded butterflies and hear poor rogues talk of court news. And we'll talk with them too. Who loses and whose wins, who's in and who's out, and take upon us the mystery of things as if we were God's spies." Now, it's rather ironic since Marlowe was a spy for the Walsingham faction of British secret intelligence. It's just ironic that he would write this line, to live as if we were God's spies. But now think, if we were looking around, finding things and trying to figure out things, and then reporting it all back to God, we couldn't really lie about anything. After all, God knows everything, and he'd know if we're lying. Also, we couldn't brag or boast of our own, say, exaggerated importance or our inflated ego, because God would know the truth of that too. And it's probably the best way to restore peace, to live as if we were God's spies. And it's something that Francis Bacon and John Dee just didn't see. There is no secret knowledge. There's only honest knowledge. And so we should explore the mystery of things honorably and honestly because we are God's spies. So it's such a wonderful little quote I like using all the time. Now, The Tempest. The Tempest would be Marlowe's last play. It's his farewell. And in the play, Prospero, which is sort of Marlowe, he talks of his daughter Miranda as his art, right? It's this very interesting concept that his plays are his children. And he takes this same idea, he uses it in the sonnets too, right? And in the play, Prospero wishes to have his daughter married. So if his plays are his children, he wishes to have his ideas passed on to others. And he wants to do this before he sets free his servant, his spirit, Ariel, which is like his muse, he calls. So he asks to be released from his exiles, that all can be forgiven, because he's going to retire. And he says, "As you from crimes would pardon be, let your indulgence set me free." And also in the sonnets, Shakespeare's sonnets would be published in 1609 in a small one-time printing just for his friends. And you can see the same idea. There's sonnet number 1. "From fairest creatures we desire increase, that thereby beauty's rose might never die. But as the riper should by time decease, his tender air might bear his memory." Now, is he talking about actual children that you want to, have your legacy in your children? Well, that's a good idea. We have to, or is he also referring to what he talks about in his Tempest, that his poems are his children? So it's a real interesting metaphor that he uses throughout the sonnets. Is he talking about having children, or is he talking about leaving something to posterity? And maybe he's actually talking about both, which I think it is. It makes the metaphor even better to read. Now, after that, no new plays by, quote, William Shakespeare would be published. But it is believed that he spent the rest of his years collaborating with other young, aspiring playwrights to help them learn the poetic art. When Christopher Marlowe actually died, or where he was actually buried, we may never know. Now, earlier, during the Irish Rebellion, Edmund Spenser had been forced to flee from his home in Ireland. And within 3 weeks of arriving back in London, Spenser would pass away in January 1599, like out of the blue. Now, the media report, it was claimed that Spenser died of poverty. Quote, he died for lack of bread. But now, this doesn't seem very likely since he was receiving a yearly pension from Queen Elizabeth. And the rest of his family didn't die of poverty. So perhaps his death is a little more mysterious than we are led to believe. I'm just going to leave it at that. Now, Spenser was buried in Westminster Abbey at what came to be called Poet's Corner, where he would always be remembered as one of the great English poets. Now, a man at Westminster Abbey named William Camden, who was the headmaster and the librarian at the Westminster Abbey School, he wrote the first guidebook to the monuments that are found in the Abbey in 1600, the year after Spenser died. And this is what he wrote of Spenser. Here, nigh to Chaucer, Spenser lies, to whom ingenious next he was, as now in tomb. Here now to Chaucer, Spenser stands thy hearse. Still nearer standest thou to him in thy verse. Whilst thou didst live, lived English poetry. Now thou art dead, it fears that it shall die. Now, Camden also wrote a history of the reign of Queen Elizabeth, which was published in 1625. And there's an interesting line in there on Spenser. And he says, Edmund Spenser was interred at Westminster, near to Chaucer, at the charge of the Earl of Essex. So the Earl of Essex paid for it. And this is important. His hearse being attended by poets and mournful elegies and poems with the pens that wrote them thrown into his tomb. So Spenser was so admired that poets would write little notes or poems to him and throw the note in his tomb, as well as the pen that they wrote him on. Now, it's very interesting that they did that, and they also did that to a number of other playwrights and poets at that time. Now, let's go to William Shakespeare now. The William Shakespeare from Stratford-upon-Avon died on April 23rd, 1616, and was quietly buried in Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-upon-Avon. But, this is important, upon the news of his death, no eulogies, no memorials, no poems were written by other poets or playwrights. No gatherings were held in London or elsewhere. No poems or pens were tossed into his grave, as was done for Spenser, and even for some other lesser-known poets. Nothing was said or done about this William Shakespeare's death. If he was the real William Shakespeare, and if he was so loved, why was nothing done upon his death? Now, let's look at some pictures here. I hope you can see them. The first one on the left is a monument of William Shakespeare, a prominent, prosperous merchant of Stratford that can still be seen today at the Stratford Church. It's not known when it was first made, and it's been redone a number of times. Now, the earliest sketches of the original monument from 1634, that's the second sketch on the left there by William Dugdale, shows Shakespeare holding a wool pack. Now, you see in the monument today, he's holding a pen and he's got a paper in the other hand. Okay, in the original monument, he's got his two hands holding a wool pack because his father was, traded in wool. And when his father died, so did he. Now, very interesting. You can also see it in a second engraving by Wenceslas Haller in 1656. Again, Shakespeare monument has two hands and he's holding a wool sack. Now, in the third one, which is from Nicholas Rose, when we quoted some of his biography of Shakespeare, his work of Shakespeare he published in 1799. Again, you see Shakespeare with two hands holding a wool pack. Now, somehow, during one of the restorations of the memorial in the church, and no one knows when, but sometime maybe 100 years after it was first put up, he's now seen holding a pen. Now, if you look at the face on the monument, this may have been how William Shakespeare of Stratford upon Avon actually looked like. But it looks nothing like the statue of William Shakespeare that is in Westminster Abbey in London, 100 miles away. Now, in 1741, a statue of Shakespeare was erected in Westminster Abbey in Poets' Corner by Alexander Pope and three of his friends. Now, that's not the same face as that of the wealthy wool merchant that is buried in Stratford. I mean, if William Shakespeare of Stratford was the real Shakespeare, don't you think they'd go and model this statue off? No. But what did they model it off of? It really looks like there was a portrait done supposedly of William Shakespeare in 1610, which really looks like the statue. But even more important, that our good friend Martin Seif pointed out, the statue does resemble the portrait of Christopher Marlowe, which was done in the year 1585, somehow got lost, and then was rediscovered in 1953, right? 72 wonderful years ago. Now, personally, I suspect that Christopher Marlowe died around 1622. And that was why work began on collecting and typesetting his plays. And in 1623, the first folio of William Shakespeare's collected plays would be published for the whole world to see and read and learn and remember, which is what Henry V said. To be remembered is our key to immortality. So I think I've spoken enough. So now, dear gentlemen and gentlewomen of the jury, I would like to hear and see your comments and whether I've successfully presented my case to you that Christopher Marlowe was the genius who wrote the plays of William Shakespeare. Thank you.
That was marvelous. Okay, absolutely marvelous. And it just made me feel, like I want to read all Marlowe's plays again. Okay. Um, I loved how you did these little short pointers for each play.
Teasers, little teasers.
Teasers,
Yes.
yes. Okay. So I have two
Yeah.
people that wanted
Uh-oh.
to say something. First was Uwe. Okay.
Huh.
Nobody has their hand up. So, okay, Uwe is first. Okay. And I think Martin Sief is after that. Okay. And then hopefully we
Martin.
have,
Oh, great. Martin.
yeah, and then we
Our good
hopefully
friend
have some
Martin.
other
Yes.
people. Okay. Uwe, you there? Hallo,
Can you,
Uwe.
yes, hello, can you hear me?
Ja.
Yes.
Right. Hi, Gerry. Wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. I have just a little question, um, because you have done meticulous research, as is obvious for anyone listening. Um, I am assuming that you also have come across that old talk by Gerry Rose, from I think it was 1995 or 6 or something like that, where he talks about Greek and Shakespearean tragedy, and in it he mentions also that Shakespeare was not Shakespeare, but that he gives the hypothesis or just an idea that it might have been John Harvard, who he said had been a neighbor of Shakespeare's. So I've tried to research this lead and I didn't get anywhere. So I just wanted to take the opportunity to ask you whether you have checked on this and what's your opinion on it. Even though I'm very much inclined to really subscribe to your presentation thesis here.
Oh, thank you, Uwe. Yeah, there's other theories out there floating, Howard. But none of them really have any proof to them. And the Francis Bacon one comes from the Rosicrucians. This is a real weird one. And the only one that really made sense to me, and I never knew about it until 5 years ago, till Martin Sief presented that, and I had to take everything else I had learned since I was a child and reorganize it to fit with that new theory, because it made so much sense. To write these plays, you had to be one of the best educated men in all of England. You had to have gone to university. You had to have been involved with the political situation at the time deeply. And Marlowe was as a spy, which really, and okay, here's another thing I actually didn't bring up in my presentation, but I could have. In early 1600s, say the year 1602, someone by the name of William Shakespeare was renting a room from a French family who had moved to London. They made ladies' hats. His last name was Mountjoy. Now, we know this is a fact because Mountjoy had a court case where his son-in-law was suing him because money he owed him. And one of the witnesses they called was William Shakespeare, because he had lived at Mountjoy's house as a boarder. So he actually goes and gives his statement of what he had there, and he actually signed it. We have a copy of William Shakespeare by Marlowe. But Mountjoy, why in Henry V, the envoy who was sent between the French army and Henry V, where they're talking back and forth, this envoy's name is Mountjoy. Where did he get this name? Well, he was living with a Frenchman named Mountjoy. And of course, Marlowe spoke French. So now at the same time where a William Shakespeare is living at the home of Mountjoy and writing him into his Henry V play, That's when William Shakespeare of Stratford, his father died. And because William was the eldest son, he inherited his house and his business. So he was moving why would he move his family into this house and now have to take over his father's business and rent a little room in, London near St. Paul Cathedral? It wasn't him. It was someone else. It was obviously Marlowe. That's just one of the other little interesting tidbits that come, but it is a theory. We can't prove it, but there's so many pieces that fit together in it. And other people will come up with, other people. But I think it's all to try to discredit what's called the Marlovian theory, that it was Christopher Marlowe that wrote the plays. The other ones really have no legitimacy. And I know of good people who believe that Francis Bacon wrote them. I'm going, oh my God. But it's meant as a distraction to take away from that point. And also to take away, I think, from the political aspect of all of his plays, particularly after Midsummer's Night Dream. He was involved politically. He had connections with people in France. Maybe that's why he was staying at the house of a Frenchman. He had a way to communicate with people, but everything else is, I find, simply a distraction. You can follow all these leads, but they don't lead to anything. They just say, we think it's this guy. Well, why do you think that? We just think it. So I think Gerry Rowe's article was very good. His presentation was very good, but I don't think he had talked to Martin Seif yet about the painting. That was his problem. And I'm sure if he would see that painting and look at him, he would come around too. I should ask him. Okay. Thanks, Uwe.
Well, thanks. And let me just add that while I was researching it, I came across that John Harvard was not even born or just very young when some of the plays had been published. So that didn't make sense to me. So I wondered whether you... Anyway, so thanks very much.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Uwe.
Yeah, that definitely would throw a wrench into the works.
That would be hard. Well, that's like the story they say about Abe Lincoln. He was born in a log cabin that he built.
Yes. All right, Martin. Our dear friend Martin, who gave such inspiration to my husband. You have something to say.
Take your time. You can take 2 hours, Martin. We can't hear you. You're on mute.
Okay, now?
Yeah, now we can hear you.
Right.
Good job.
I mean, Gerry, that was just wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank
that
you.
was just that was just masterful, and it was pitch perfect. And one never stops learning, as we all. That's why we're all here, because we all know in an open-ended universe, one can never know everything, and that's not bad news. It's humbling news, but it's also wonderful news, because we don't seal off the truth the way the medieval and academic schoolmen did, and the way the Inquisition did, and the way all their modern successors in so-called academia do. It's just wonderful. A couple of thoughts occurred to me, and one of them, a word play which is quite extraordinary, which I did not learn in my studies. It came to me by accident. It was taught to me by a friend who at the time, lost track of him decades ago, but he was an Encyclopedia Britannica salesman for his living. This is back when I was in my 20s as a student in London. And I don't know where he got it from, but it's this. If you look at the King James Version of the Bible, which is published in 1610, when both Marlowe and the dolts, the theoretical, the factual Shakespeare, are both 46 years old. And this is very easily verified by everyone here. Pull down a copy of the King James Version of the Bible, turn to the book of Psalms, and turn to Psalm 46. Right, and it's published in the 46th year of Marlowe's life, but also of Shakespeare's. Count 46 words from the beginning of the psalm. The 46th word is shake. Count 46 words from the end of the psalm. The 46th word is spear. Shakespeare. And yes, the point, of course, is something Marlowe is also maintained by scholars such as the late Rebecca Ballantyne as having been responsible for the great, extraordinarily beautiful and poetic first translation of Cervantes' Don Quixote into English. And this comes back to something I've talked on before, and that's central to what you're saying, which is the paucity of genius. That when you have extraordinarily brilliant figures and you see their creative talent reflected in the same way in later masterpieces. I mean, I'm hostile to Tolstoy in many ways, but he's arguably certainly one of the very greatest novelists, if not the greatest, who ever lived. And when you read War and Peace, and then when you turn to Anna Karenina, it's clearly by the same guy. And as you pointed out, if one looks at these extraordinary, and as I did too, the extraordinary early works of Marlowe, the warm-up period of a creative genius, was very precocious, and then you go to to so-called Shakespeare's plays, it's by the same guy. Nobody else writes the way these two guys do. Nobody else does sonnets the way these two guys do. Nobody else knows court intrigue and the secret state the way these two guys do, as you have said. And therefore, we also know that Shakespeare's work, and presumably, therefore, whoever the man was, if he was still alive, the man himself, James the First, who had been James VI of Scotland, loves the works of Shakespeare. This is very well known and very well documented. It's even in popular culture. And so Shakespeare's work, far from suffering an eclipse when the old queen dies, comes back more strongly than ever. And what do we find, as you've pointed out, in the Scottish play? James had a terror of witches. He revered his father. He never forgave his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, for murdering his father. And this is all reflected in the life of, the presumed life of Marlowe after Shakespeare died. And when we look at the Scottish play, the terror of witches plays to the terror that James had of witches. It's a very ugly reality, because while James was a very tolerant and cultured and peace-loving and in many respects most admirable of monarchs in so many ways, one of the greatest things rightly held against him is his paranoid fear of witches and the number of innocent women who died as a result of it. But you have put this also in an extraordinarily convincing and explanatory context as well. So we have this too. And I love the concept that you said, there is no secret knowledge. There is only honest knowledge. And what do we find when we look at what little we know, although we actually know quite a bit about the beliefs of the Freemasons and the Rosicrucians, and especially our old friends from Yale, including at least two presidents of the United States, no doubt there were more, the Bushes, the Skull and Bone Society. We find in their secret knowledge not secret truths, but secret lies, secret myths, secret fantasies. So the people who think they are in the know because they are secret are actually being led astray, not by secret truths, but by secret absurdities and lies. And this is an enormously powerful and important understanding. Again, which fits with the fact that everything is the opposite of what we are taught it is. Things we are told are lies and beneath contempt, like the idea that Marlowe wrote Shakespeare, are clear and obvious. And we find an enormous number of people like Nathaniel Hawthorne, like Charles Dickens, even people I have contempt for, like George Bernard Shaw. But they have so many people who were people of accomplishment and note themselves are convinced that Shakespeare cannot have been Shakespeare. And even when they don't progress to what should be a very straightforward truth, at least since Calvin Hoffman published his breakthrough book, The Man Who Was Shakespeare, in 1955. And again, this comes out only 2 years after, you could say, again, you make the point, Gerry, and it's all there in the great poetry, in the great plays, that immortality comes from being remembered, from one's work and truth being remembered. And Marlowe, one could argue, is eclipsed until he is resurrected in 1953, when that extraordinary painting of him, which is indisputably of him, is discovered unexpectedly at Christ Church College in 1953 during a renovation. And it's a resurrection from the dead for the true Shakespeare who was Christopher Marlowe. And with all the efforts in the world, nobody has been able to bury him back in his grave ever since. One last point I would add, and that is, I think, a very central point to what you brought out brilliantly. You bring out brilliantly, very profoundly, the truth and integrity and passion that we find in the man who was Shakespeare, the man who actually wrote the plays and the sonnets. That there is a passion for virtue, there is a passion for understanding, there is a passion for truth. None of this is, as you also so brilliantly point out, none of this can be applied to Francis Bacon. After 40 years in Washington and around it, Bacon's, as you did so brilliantly bring him out, is a figure all too familiar to me. He's Senator Arlen Specter, the man who came up with the magic bullet theory. To prove that Lee Harvey Oswald alone must have killed President Kennedy, and who then prospers to become senator for life in Pennsylvania, a figure of complete contempt and corruption. If there is resurrection, he is the resurrection of Francis Bacon. Another Francis Bacon, a man who will argue in terms of the law on every side of the issue. He's the opposite to Portia, who is presented to us as the embodiment of the righteous law, who uses her even twists the law in order to get an innocent man off the hook. And again, Marlowe must have identified with Antonio because he had been set up to take the fall, which is why his death had to be faked and he'd be spirited out of the country in the first place. So he clearly does identify with Antonio. And he makes the bad guy. He makes Shylock obviously an extraordinary, credible, bleeding, profound human being, but he's still the villain of the piece. From Shakespeare / Marlowe's perspective, there's no question about that. And Portia is getting an innocent man off the hook. That's the whole driving theme of the play. But by contrast, Bacon is a brilliant lawyer who uses the law for lies. And who is he destroying? He's destroying the Earl of Essex, who I would maintain is also the model for Hamlet. And I was led to this by a friend of mine, happily still very much with us, a genius, a brilliant man, the analyst of fourth generation war, and how subversion is used to undermine the state from within, a very Shakespearean type theme and obsession. And a very eminent fellow who's now happily still with us, but now retired, called William S. Lind. There are two William Linds, and the other one is not worth dealing with on this matter. He's a hack man for the Democrats. But the original Bill Lind from Cleveland, where she is now retired, is a very profound fellow, and he was the man who gave this insight to me, because he had worked for Senator Gary Hart when Hart was looked on as a potential future president of the United States. And he found him a brilliant man, in his intellect an honest man. He liked the ladies, and like most, was very inept in hiding the fact ineptly, and that's what derailed his political career. He told reporters to actually follow him to prove he didn't have a secret girlfriend. So they followed him and found him with a secret girlfriend. Can you ever come across anything so stupid or inept as a way to handle or defuse your private life? There we are. And Bill Lind had a very wonderful take on Gary Hart, who he knew all too well. He said, Gary Hart is Hamlet. And if you look at the history of the Earl of Essex, who Rebecca Ballantyne, certainly to my conviction, maintains was the secret illegitimate son of Queen Elizabeth I. And this explains why he was mad enough to try and seize the throne and not have it be shifted off to James I instead, because he knew he was the Queen's son as well as the Queen's much-loved favourite. And he bungles it, because he bungles everything he did, just as Hamlet does. But look at the puzzlement that we see in Hamlet. On the one hand, here is this asshole who brings madness and death and despair to everyone around him, who drives the girl who loves him purely and dearly, Ophelia, to suicide. And I never had any sympathy for Hamlet as a character. And I only felt I understood the character when an actor who is routinely loathed and despised, but a man of extraordinary genius and power, given what he's achieved, plays him. Mel Gibson. I recommend to everyone, exactly, Mr. Action Man, Mad Max himself. He played, but that's the point. If you look at the way he plays Hamlet, it's like the way he directs The Passion of the Christ. It's powerful, it's direct, it's not sophisticated, it's not intellectual, but he gets to the core of things. And his Hamlet is what Dostoevsky calls the superfluous man. He's Stavrogin in Dostoevsky's The Devils, the charming, charismatic, brilliant hero who everybody loves, but who is totally self-destructive and isn't doomed by his enemies. He's doomed by himself in everything he does. And Mel Gibson understands this. He plays him as a spoiled brat. And other people are too academic or sophisticated or subtle to see this. But Rebecca Ballantyne explains the paradox in this, that Shakespeare, who reveres, as you say, real kings, real heroes like Henry V, adores Hamlet as this perfect prince. And yet, he also displays him as a self-destructive nightmare, as a self-destructive loser, who brings nothing but failure and destruction, just as Robert Dudley, Earl of Essex, did. Why does Shakespeare / Marlowe, who is so brilliant and all-seeing when he looks at kings both admirable and disastrous, still love and revere Hamlet when he sees the fault of him? The one other thing I would add, and again, this is not to take away from your wonderful presentation, which I have, at the cost of sounding absurd and ingratiating and biased, just as you look, we go back years, thank God, together now, and we have only met. In all these years, we have only been able to meet face to face this way on Zoom so often, and I hope we can do it directly sooner rather than later in this life as well as in the Akashic record beyond it. But again, you make this so clear where our friend is coming from. By our friend, I mean the great poet himself, and his central theme of integrity. Because when you just take that and you look at the life of Francis Bacon cannot have been the poet, cannot have been Shakespeare. He's repulsive. And as I indicate here, if anyone goes to the extraordinary book by Rebecca Ballantyne, Marlowe Up Close, because she claims to have decoded all these ciphers, which are beyond me. Maybe she was completely delusional and mad. I do not, of course, believe that. But I'm not in a position to independently verify it either, because I don't have a head for these ciphers. For anyone here, you, Uwe, Jenny, Magdalena, Matt, Cynthia, Richard, anyone who can go to Ballantyne's work and either disprove or prove her either way, please do so, because it's just beyond me. But having said that, she identifies the later life of Marlowe as having been the senior diplomat, either the number 2 or number 2 man running the British embassy in comfort and in wealth for the last 15 years of his life in Venice. And again, we have the Venetian connection again. We have the centrality of Venetian influence in the courts of not just Queen Elizabeth I, where it truly begins, but in the court of James I, where, as you rightly point out, it comes to fruition. And actually, one other thing I'd add to people here, and I've already inflicted this on you, Matt, in recent weeks. I had to be in hospital to have a leg infection treated a few weeks ago. And the food was hideous. The doctors and nurses and even the basic staff were quite wonderful. They're wonderful people. But the food was utterly hideous. I could not touch it. It was supposed to be healthy for you. And I don't believe it was for a second. But I survived because my wife and daughter brought me in a regular supply of cheddar cheese and grapes. And that I flourished. Right. But the other wonderful thing, as well as being cured of my infection, because the doctors and nurses and staff were wonderful and they were competent, I found on a TV channel there, on the I think the AME, American Movie Channel, if I recall it correctly, they're showing an amazing show called Nautilus, which is Jules Verne done right. And I cannot recommend it strongly enough. Oh, but if any of you can find, I cannot find a copy of it to access online. I cannot find a DVD I can buy. If anyone here can do so, please do. Because here's the thing, it was funded by Disney, and then Disney pulled the plug on it. Why did they pull the plug on it? Because it was very virtually without trace, but it's proving immensely popular, apparently, on AME. Because it is the story, it is the backstory of Nemo, done right, and the way Jules Verne would have wanted it to done, exposing the imperialism of the British Empire with a central theme you again have brought out, Gerry. Exactly. The true evil of the monstrous octopus, the true monstrous octopus that Nemo fights and kills in the show is the British East India Company, which is portrayed, as you put it, as not just enslaved ruling India, but as doing so more monstrously, rapaciously, genocidally, but also enslaving the peoples of Africa and Asia. And the Nautilus, the wonderful submarine, is built to wage war in China and enslave China too, which, of course, the British did. But what we have here, it's portrayed as a modern BlackRock. It's portrayed as a modern, supra-powerful company, which is more powerful than any government, including the British government, and is independent of them, and is determined to enslave the world. And this was too much for Disney. The people who actually made the show are very interesting. It has a multinational cast with a magnificent British Shakespearean actor of Pakistani Muslim background playing the Hindu Captain Nemo. And Captain Nemo in Verne hates the British Empire and recognizes it as a rapacious, monstrous, out-of-control force. and wages war against it to destroy the slave trade. This is all in the original Verne, and you find none of it in the Disney movie of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which has been rubbed clean in 1955. James Mason is a very honorable and admirable figure as
Hey, Marty,
Captain.
can you put a link to that show in the chat box so that everyone can Google it
Well,
and find it?
yes
Yeah,
and no.
thank you.
But let me do it verbally now. If everybody goes to YouTube, you will find on YouTube shortened versions of the first 7 or 8 episodes. Hopefully, the last 2 will go on as well, but they haven't as yet. But I've been able to. Each show was about 1 hour, 20 minutes long, uncut. And you find cut versions, which nevertheless gain the essence of the show, for free on YouTube. Just look for Nautilus. Nautilus on YouTube, and it's there. But I'm still looking. I haven't been able to access the last 2 episodes yet. Perhaps because AME hasn't run it yet. I'm not sure, or they're about to run it.
Somebody just posted.
Yeah,
Thank you.
moving on.
Yes, that's perfect. Exactly.
And okay, fantastic, because you were
Uwe, bless you. Go on again. Sorry, go on.
You're referring to the great Kraken, okay?
Yes.
In the Nautilus, okay, which brings me back to Francis Bacon. And
Yes.
and Matt had a question.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing all of that, Marty. And I wish that I was there for the whole class. I only got the last little bit, but I read your essay, Gerry, and that blew my mind. And thank you, Marty, for planting that seed into Gerry's head, that splinter that he had to get out with it, with this
fertile ground. A great forest has grown.
Yeah, just glad to seed the water and he did the rest. But no, I got a question for you, Gerry, just in regards. Well, it's sort of, I guess, 2 questions, but the first one, they're not related. The first one is the later plays by Shakespeare between like 1608 and 1603, or Marlowe. I should call him Marlowe from now on. Anyway, Pericles, Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale, The Tempest, and then apparently The Two Noble Kingsmen and Henry VIII. I've read most of them. I didn't read Henry VIII, though I probably should. They're really difficult for my mind to follow the intention. And I know you're brushing on The Tempest and the meaning there. So number one, I was wondering if you had any thoughts of like why he went to a more, they're called the tragicomedies or the comedies, and they're very fanciful, kind of like, yeah, they're super fanciful, playful, kind of weird, less obvious than when I read like Hamlet or Macbeth or the history plays. So why do you think he was doing that at that time in England? Number two, why do you think he, oh yeah, and also I think it was Gerald Belsky had this thesis or this theory that the Tempest had to do or was connected to the colonization project of the Americas. And I don't know if you talked about that at all in your class or not, but can you speak to that idea?
Okay, all right. First, I want to make a comment on what Marty said. The book by Valentine, I read that book. I loved it. But when I got to the cipher part,
yes,
I didn't want to use it as proof because I was attacking the ciphers of Donnelly and Pott.
Exactly.
So I said, okay, I can't use cipher as my proof because I've just said the ciphers these other lunatics use weren't. So I used her stuff, but I didn't use the cipher stuff. But it's a very good book, and her connection with Cervantes I really liked. So that's why I didn't do the ciphers. The other one on Hamlet, I totally agree with your idea of Hamlet, that he was terrified of the thought of immortality, right? And if people read To Be or Not to Be speech from that standpoint, to be or not to be, meaning immortality, that's what he was afraid of. And that's why he failed to act the way a hero would have, but a coward did. So that's on Hamlet. The other thing I didn't bring it up today, although I did write about it when I did the little article on The Merchant of Venice, because I do not see Shylock as the villain. I see Venice as the villain. And the history of Jews living in Venice at the time is Jewish people were forbidden to have jobs except for two. There was only two jobs that they could work at in all of Venice. One was selling rags, which means they sold used clothing, used furniture, whatever, what we today would call a thrift store.
Yes.
And the second thing was they could lend money, but only to people who had no credit. So if you look at these, check cashing places for people who have no credit today, okay, so Jewish people were only allowed to run check cashing places and thrift stores. And then they complain about them for doing that. But it was Venice's laws that told them that's all you can do.
Yes,
so the
yes,
whole
exactly.
villain is Venice is the villain. You've created this situation where Jewish people can only have one or two jobs, and now you complain about it. So that's the point I really saw in the Merchant of Venice that I really liked. Shylock has problems, but he's not the villain. Venice is the villain. And okay, Matt, those other plays that you were talking about, I don't believe that Shakespeare wrote them completely. I believe he was helping other young playwrights write those plays, and he has to let them go with what they're doing, and he tries to help here and there. So you see glimpses of them now and then, but those plays that aren't that good, he didn't write them. His you could say his students were trying to copy him. They really didn't do a good job of it. The only one is The Tempest. The Tempest, I know he did it. I read that article too on that The Tempest has something to do with colonizing America, and I just didn't see it. I don't agree with it, but not, disagreement. I think it's more as Marlowe saying, this is it. I'm going to retire. And this is my last play I'm going to write. And that's why I'm releasing Ariel, my spirit. He's releasing his muse. He's letting him go. And I think in my thinking, that's what I think it is about. I don't see, although the whole colonization of America is part of the politics going on in England at the time, but I don't see it in the play. Because then, Raleigh is for the colonization, and then he gets sucked into this thing where he's looking for the lost city of, what do you call it? The gold in Peru or something, and El Dorado. Yeah, he's looking for El Dorado, and it's like, that's not colonization. You've switched over to the wrong side. You've given up. So there may be something to it in there about America. I just didn't see it. Maybe I didn't spend enough time on it, but I saw it mostly as him talking to the audience as his farewell. That was my view.
What about John Dee? Did he come into your play at all? And John Dee's now did he play him?
John Dee. I was hoping you'd go into John Dee in your presentation. I don't see John Dee anywhere near, unless, Dr. Faustus, maybe Marlowe's talking about John Dee in that play. There's a good example. But the only thing I came across was, John Dee, he went over to Germany and got into all this weird stuff, and then they chased him out of there. He came back to England, and then he wrote this letter. You can actually get it. He wrote a letter to King James, saying, please, you got to tell these people to stop slandering me and calling me all this and that, and I'm talking with devils. He says, no, I don't talk to devils. I only talk to angels. I only talk to the good spirits. So he's totally into spiritism and reading crystal balls, but I only talk to the good spirits. I don't talk to devils. Tell them to stop slandering me. So I don't have much to say about John Dee, but maybe he was being attacked in Dr. Faustus.
Thanks.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Gerry. I have a question, okay? Maybe a little naive question, but what do you think? What is your hypothesis? Why Francis Bacon is being put forward as being Shakespeare? I mean, what's the benefit of this? Why?
Oh boy. It's called cultural warfare that
Yes.
particularly those of us who lived through the wacko 60s and the counterculture, we saw it right there. We didn't maybe not know it at the time, but my goodness, we see it now. And it's to destroy the positive aspect of English literature, English culture. And what I've tried to do, starting with King Arthur and Geoffrey Chaucer, Edmund Spenser. God, someday I'd love to do a class on the Fairy Queen. That would blow people's minds. And Christopher Marlowe, is to see that common thread, that common connection. I mean, okay, we're always attacking the British Empire and Queen and everything, but hey, there was some positive developments that took place in England. And we have to remember, we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We have to remember those. And I think the thing about, Bacon writing is just to confuse people, right? Because if Bacon wrote Shakespeare's play, then there's no common thread. There's no, as Martin said, there's no passion, no reason why he was writing these plays. And if you see, it's really the attempts to create an English language that was the project involved, particularly with Spenser and Harvey, where they had to invent words because they weren't there in English. I mean, prior to Henry V, the language spoken in the court was French. Everybody spoke French. The great thing about Henry V is he spoke English at court. And so now people had to learn English, and there wasn't much of there wasn't much of English in terms of plays and poetry. And so it was a project to develop it. And I think with the whole Francis Bacon thing is just a diversion to try to stop people seeing the positive aspect of the English language, but also with Henry V, the funny scene, with Fluellen. Henry V is saying, I'm a Welshman, I wear the leek in my hat on St. David's Day. So it's because he was, from Monmouth. He through that Welsh connection, he's saying, I'm going back to King Arthur. That's what he's saying in the play, Henry V. And that's why Marlowe is making Henry V his hero, his best play so far. And you say to yourself, well, where the hell did Henry V come from? He's a nobody. He wasn't that smart. In fact, it's funny. You read the parts about him in Falstaff. Henry V was a real asshole when he was young. But the important thing is that Henry V's grandfather was John of Gaunt. And John of Gaunt's best friend was Geoffrey Chaucer. It was his brother-in-law. And so you can imagine the education that Henry V got just hanging around this guy. And at a certain point, he realized what his education was. And so the Francis Bacon thing is just it's a Venetian operation, and as I say, it's a distraction, as most of the counterculture was, right? It's cynicism, it's stoicism. You know, there's no reason in the world. It's whatever you feel like, you know. So you're going to live your life in the lower trigram of the I Ching. You're going to live only motivated by your emotions. You're not going to rise to the level of ideas. And you know, even because that line that he has in Midsummer's Night Dream, you know, from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. So he's looking at how do you go from, you know, the realm of space and time into the realm of ideas back and forth, right? Forget this induction, deduction bullshit. That's not how the world works. It works on ideas. How do I get into the land of timeless ideas and back? I got to come back too. I can't just stay there.
Yes.
I'm not I can't be a fairy. I got to come back. So it's a whole different outlook in terms of knowledge. What they do, Bacon invented induction and instead of Aristotle's deduction. It's all bullshit. It's the same thing. I mean, there's nothing wrong with induction and deduction. They can be very useful in working things out, but they're not going to give you a new idea. If you want a new idea, you got to be able to go into the upper trigram. You've got to go through Kairos to get there. That's that little line, right? That Quan keeps talking about, Kairos, right? What you do at a certain point. And I think there's something with the Chinese, you know, where the word for opportunity is also the word for crisis or something. So it's an interesting idea of Kairos. But yeah, Bacon, he was a thief. Even the Parliament of Great Britain kicked him out because he was bribing everybody when he got to be Solicitor General. So maybe he stole his ideas.
All right. Thank you very much, Gerry. I think with that, we want to close today's session of the Rising Tide Foundation, unless anybody else has something else to say. But I want to thank you very much, Gerry. It was an enlightening and inspiring. And as I said, hopefully many people will take Shakespeare, read Shakespeare today before bed. Okay. Thank you so very, very much. Okay. And goodbye, everybody. Till next Sunday.
Okay.
Bye, everyone. Thank you, Gerry. Thank you, Madeline.
Okay, Matt.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay,
oh, and next week we're gonna have Hans. Hans is gonna do a thing on Francis Bacon next week.
Yes. Excellent.
Okay, perfect.
We continue the attack on Francis Bacon next week. All right, Hans.
Segue, Gerry.
Right on, guys.
Okay, yeah. Okay, there we go. Good job. Okay. All right. Bye-bye, everybody. Okay.
Okay.
Bye.